Hi, so after our unit 2 on cell membrane and how diffusion and osmosis work, we're now moving on to our unit 3. And unit 3 is focused on metabolism. So our first lesson is to look at what exactly metabolism is. We will look at the two types or the two major categories of metabolism, and we'll understand the structure of ATP, how it functions, how it provides energy for the cell to function. And then we'll get to know how to read a metabolic pathway map. Now, if you look at this extremely complicated diagram, it's a collection of most of the chemical reactions that happen inside a particular part of the cell. And that's not all the chemical reactions. There are hundreds and thousands of chemical reactions that happens inside the body, inside the cell, every single second. Now, there are so many chemical reactions because for us to produce parts or proteins or things that the body requires to function, it needs a lot of steps and it needs multiple chemical reactions to produce those final products. You're not required to remember or memorize any of these metabolic pathways that this unit is going to introduce to you. However, you are expected to be able to read a map or read a pathway when it's provided to you. Now, if we define metabolism in biology, it's basically the sum of all the chemical reactions that take place within a cell of a living organism. And these chemical reactions are providing energy for vital processes, and they are synthesizing organic material that the body requires. It can also break down things that are unwanted for the body, or it can break down things for the body to use if they were larger. So, for example, digestion in your stomach and your small intestine. If we were to summarize this really long and lengthy definition, we would use this phrase. It's basically chemical reactions that construct or destroy chemical compounds. Now, all of these chemical reactions can be sorted into two major categories. They're called anabolic reactions or catabolic reactions. Now, what I want you to do is, I don't want to spoon feed you the definitions. So you're going to pause the video and you're going to write down the definitions based on what you see in the diagram. So you have to interpret the diagram and come up with the definition. The keywords that I'm expecting to see in your definitions for both anabolic and catabolic is energy, smaller molecules, and larger molecules. Right, so make sure you have those three keywords in your definitions for anabolic and catabolic reactions. Pause the video and do that now. So here's your answer. Anabolic reaction on the left-hand side is basically using energy to build larger molecules from smaller molecules. Whereas catabolic reaction is quite the opposite. It's breaking down larger molecules into smaller molecules, and during which energy is released. Here's a practice exercise for you now that you have the definitions. I want you to pause the video and sort these reactions into the two major categories. Okay, I'm going to assume that you have made a reasonable attempt. The first one, DNA replication. That's basically making a copy of your original DNA strand from nucleotides. Nucleotides are the monomers in nucleic acid. If you remember from Unit 1, nucleic acid is one of the 4 biomolecule categories. So DNA strand is a polymer, it's very long. Nucleotides are monomers. So if you're building that, that means it's anabolic reaction. Digesting protein into amino acid. Protein is a polymer. Amino acid is a monomer that builds protein. So this is breaking protein down, meaning that it's catabolic reaction. Turning glucose into starch. If you studied well for your unit 1, you know that glucose is a monomer, where starch is a polymer made up of repeating units of glucose. So that's building a chain of glucose, meaning that it is anabolic. Now, photosynthesis and cellular respiration is a slightly more complicated one. You can search up the equation for photosynthesis. It's using sunlight and water and also carbon dioxide. And then you're turning it into glucose, oxygen, and you release ATP. For cellular respiration, you're flipping it. So you're turning it around, you're using glucose and you're using oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and glucose. So if you look at those equations, glucose is the larger molecule. So in photosynthesis, if glucose is produced, meaning that it's anabolic, whereas in cellular respiration, you're breaking down glucose, meaning that it is catabolic. And then the last one is making cell membrane from fatty acids, which is phospholipid bilayer. That's what makes up the cell membrane. Phospholipid is a monomer and the cell membrane is a polymer. So that means this must be an anabolic reaction. Now, why do we care about metabolism? It's responsible for a lot of disorder in the human race. Usually animals, unless they're domestic, otherwise they don't get obesity or they rarely become anorexic because of mental health issues. But humans, we somehow have these. So the balance between these catabolic and anabolic reactions is pretty important because during anabolic reaction, that's when your energy is used in the format of ATP. Whereas catabolic, you release energy. So if you use a lot of energy and have a lot of anabolic reaction, but you are not doing enough catabolic reaction to release energy and have energy stored, then you're going to lose weight. Whereas if you break down a lot of large molecules and release a lot of energy, but you're not really using them in anabolic reaction, then naturally speaking, you're going to gain weight. So ATP is our universal energy unit for providing energy inside the cell. And you will need to know how it functions. It's like this most basic knowledge that you must have in metabolism in this unit. Now, I'm not going to do this with you. You can do this on your own. We've already done it during the lesson. And so is this basal metabolic rate. So BMR stands for basal metabolic rate. You can calculate your own basal metabolic rate using these two equations. Basal metabolic rate means that it's the minimal amount of energy that is required to sustain your life when you're not doing anything. Basically, if you're just lying on the ground, breathing and keeping your heart pumping, how much energy are you using per day? I'm not going to assess you on this. It's just for your information. All right. If you're interested, you can look into it. But what I do need you to know is this ATP molecule. ATP is called adenosine triphosphate. Now, what I want you to do is pause your video, go back to your unit 1 notes in the biomolecule unit, identify the different parts that makes up this molecule. Remember, your 4 categories of biomolecule is carbohydrate, lipid, nucleic acid, and protein. So pause the video and do that now. Okay, I assume that you've made a reasonable attempt. So let's look at this. Hopefully, it's quite obvious to you that there's somehow a nucleotide-looking thing in here. If you remember from your unit 1, a nucleotide is the monomer of a DNA or an RNA strand. It's part of under the nucleic acid category. Now, inside a nucleotide, there are 3 components. All nucleotides will have these 3. The first one is the nitrogenous base, so it has nitrogen in it. And the second one is a sugar. And this sugar can be either ribose sugar, which is seen in RNA, or deoxyribose sugar, which is seen in RNA. Now, in this case, if you look at the sugar, this oxygen is present. So that means it's not a deoxyribose sugar. It's just a ribose sugar. And then the last component, the third component, is a phosphate right here. Now, adenosine triphosphate, as you can see, it has 3 phosphate. If we look at the word phosphate, it just means a phosphorus bonded to oxygen. Now, there's a very similar looking molecule called adenosine diphosphate, and it's crucial in how ATP functions. Because if you remember from grade 9, we learned about energy in the last physics unit. And energy can be classified into potential energy, which means they're energy that can be stored, or they can be classified into kinetic energy, which is energy involved in movement. So when there is something that is moving, there's energy. Chemical energy is a type of potential energy, meaning that it's energy that you can store. And the way that we store it is by having chemical bonds. So every single chemical bond that you see in the structure will have chemical energy in it. And when you break the bond, you release the chemical energy that was originally stored inside that bond. And the way that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, function is by breaking off the final phosphate inside this molecule. And as you break that bond, you're going to release energy. And the molecule became adenosine diphosphate, meaning that there is now only 2 phosphate groups left. Now, if we were to represent this using a diagram, it would kind of look like this. So an ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, you can see it as a fully charged battery. It has the energy in it. And as you use the energy, you break off that phosphate and turn it into adenosine diphosphate. You're now dealing with a dead battery. So the energy has been released. The battery is dead. You can recharge that battery by adding the phosphate back on to the ADP, and you can turn it back into ATP. Now, this process of adding the phosphate back into ADP is done inside the mitochondria, and you have to know this, right? We've talked before that in grade 6, you've been taught by Miss Pardini, and you know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse inside the cell. And we say that because the mitochondria is responsible for recharging this dead battery back into its ATP format. Now, on the opposite side, this arrow, the use of ATP and the release of energy, that happens inside just anywhere in the cell. So every single thing that the cell is doing or performing, it requires energy. And that's basically everywhere inside the cell. So the left-hand side of this arrow happens only in the mitochondria, usually. And then the right-hand side of this arrow, releasing energy, happens anywhere. Okay, once we know how ATP functions, I'm going to teach you how to read a metabolic pathway. When we use the word metabolic pathway, we are referring to the sequence of chemical reactions that happened, and that would usually lead to the production of a final product. So if we look at this metabolic pathway on the right-hand side, you could see that it starts with a molecule, which is called 3-hydroxy-3-methylglutarol-CoA. It's a very long chemical name. And if through a series of chemical reactions, you have cholesterol being produced and another two final products as well. Now, these are the words that I do expect you to know or to be able to use. You don't have to memorize these definitions word for word, but you need to know how to use them or identify them in a metabolic pathway. Substrate is basically a chemical compound that goes into a chemical reaction. If you've done chemistry, you'll know that chemical reactions are often represented by an arrow looking like this. On the left-hand side, or the beginning of that arrow, is what we call a substrate. It goes into a reaction. After the reaction, what comes out at the end of the arrow is called the product. Now, initial substrate refers to the very first substrate in the metabolic pathway, whereas an intermediate substrate are substrate that are both a product and a substrate. For example, methylonic acid right here, it is a product of this chemical reaction. However, it is also acting as a substrate for this chemical reaction that follows. Hence, we call them intermediate substrates. Enzymes is something that you have been taught before in Unit 1. They are under the protein category of biomolecules, and it is inside the body to help speed up chemical reaction. Because a chemical reaction looking like this, for example, methylonic acid being turned into methylonate 5-phosphate, that reaction can naturally happen if you give it enough time, for example, 1,000 years, but you can't wait that long. And you need it to happen immediately within seconds. And so you'll need an assistant, which is the enzyme, to help speed up that process. And in a metabolic pathway, enzymes are written right next to an arrow, meaning that that is a reaction that this particular enzyme is assisting. So the enzyme are very specialized in their chemical reactions. They can only be used for speeding up one particular type of chemical reactions. And a little trick to see if something is an enzyme is to look at the end of that word, or you can call it the suffix. ASE is usually what is being used. For example, you can see kinase. Kinase means like cutting something. And then decarboxylase, it means like you're deleting a carboxyl group. Synthase, which is also related to synthesis, it means that you're making something. So HMG-CoA synthase means that you're making HMG-CoA. So if you see the word ASE, usually you can make that judgment and say, okay, this must be an enzyme. So these are all the words that I've taught you. What I want you to do now is a little understanding check question. Look at the diagram, and I want you to label for me which of these number is corresponding to chemical reaction, which of them is the final product, which one is initial substrate, intermediate substrate, and enzymes. Pause the video and do that now. Okay, I assume that you've made an attempt. Number 1 is pointing to a chemical molecule at the very top, and so you will know that it is an initial substrate. Number 2, they're pointing to these two, kinase and decarboxylase, meaning that it must be an enzyme because it's written right next to an arrow. Number three are final products. You notice that it is what the body is interested in. There is not another arrow after that word. And then number four are the intermediate substrates. So they're both a product from the previous reaction, but then they act as a substrate for the next one. So there's an arrow before and after that word. That's the little shortcut. And then the last number, number 5, are pointing to all the arrows, and that is chemical reaction. Cool. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Do your revision, and then I'll give you a little non-graded quiz to test how well you understand this during class time. Bye.